Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the public workshop on the addendum to a framework for regulating direct potable reuse, presenting the early draft anticipated criteria for stakeholder input. The goal of the workshop is to receive oral feedback from stakeholders on the addendum. My name is David Zenschius. I'm an engineer with the Recycled Water Unit, and I'll be emceeing the workshop. Next slide. Before we start, good morning, everyone. I want to make sure that those of you who wish to a framework for regulating direct potable reuse, presenting the early draft anticipated criteria for stakeholder input. The goal of the workshop is to receive oral feedback from stakeholders on the addendum. My name is David Zenschius. I'm an engineer with the Recycled Water Unit, and I'll be emceeing the workshop. Next slide.
David, this is Eugene. I believe you're logged in through the webcast on Cal EPA. Please close your browser.
Sorry about that. Just a few notes here about public participation. Before we start, I want to make sure that those of you who wish to provide oral comment on the addendum are logged in on Zoom and send an email to the DDW Recycled Water email address containing the information listed here. Next slide. Here's an overview of today's workshop. I'll go over a few workshop rules. Then we will provide a brief summary of the addendum in a 55-minute presentation. We have 4 presenters today. Randy Barnard, Chief of the Technical Operations Section, Robert Holtquist, Principal Engineer and Recycled Water Guru, Brian Bernados, DDW's Recycled Water Technical Specialist, and Jing Chow, Technical Specialist and lead for DDW's DPR work group. Next slide. Please hold on to your comments until after the presentation is done. If you have a quick clarification question on a slide, you can enter it in the chat box, and we might answer it during the presentation. Comments may be limited to a set amount of time based on the number of people wishing to speak. All participants will be muted until it is your turn to speak. When you're called, you can unmute your microphone. We ask that you begin by stating your name and affiliation. When finished, your microphone will be turned off. We also have our Zoom admins helping out. If you have any technical issues or questions, please type them into the chat or email us at ddwrecycledwater@waterboards.ca.gov. And now, without further ado, Randy will start off the presentation. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. As David said, my name is Randy Barnard, and this is an exciting time for drinking water, recycled water, and the controlled joining of the two. Today is really the beginning of our formal public outreach effort to get your feedback on our draft DPR regulations that we posted. So we look forward to hearing any comments or suggestions that you may have. Next slide, please. But before we get into the draft regulations, let's take a step back and recap how we got here. So legislation, SB 918, required the Department of Public Health to investigate the feasibility of developing uniform water recycled water criteria for DPR, or direct potable reuse. We, now being the state water board, submitted a feasibility report to the legislature on our findings of this back in December of 2016. It contained an implementation plan with the research recommendations from the expert panel, among other things. In 2017, another bill, AB 574, was enacted. That bill required us to develop criteria for raw water augmentation by December of 2023. It also required another expert panel to make a finding of this draft criteria that it would be protective of public health. And it also recommended that we develop a framework for DPR ahead of time. So we developed the framework in 2018. It contained the board, or us, our thinking on how we could regulate DPR in the future. We posted it for stakeholder feedback, and based on that feedback we received, we updated the framework in 2019. And in that framework, we specified that we could develop DPR regulations for all forms of DPR, not just the raw water augmentation, by December 2023. Then we started funding for the research project recommended in the feasibility report. We also started drafting criteria. We weren't waiting, we got into it. And then we started setting up a contract to form this new expert panel, which all brings us to where we are today. We have all the research done. We completed our first draft of the DPR criteria, and now we're requesting public feedback before all this gets sent to our expert panel to verify if it's protective of public health or not. Next slide, please. So I talked about research. What research are we talking about here? Well, the state boards felt that there was certain research recommended by the first expert panel, which is listed here on the screen, that was important to be done before adopting DPR criteria. So we helped fund the research, and it was all completed as of early this year. It was all coordinated by the Water Reuse Foundation. They held several workshops with the research investigators, and they presented at most of the water reuse and AWWA conferences held between 2019 up until now. The Water Research Foundation also plans to hold a couple more workshops early June this year to present the final results of all the DPR research. So stay tuned for that. And here's a link on how you can get some more information from them. Next slide, please. Now, before we dive into the details of the criteria, I need to give you a high-level summary of what our work doing the feasibility report and the framework document provided to us. Of course, we need to make sure that we protect public health, but from what? Well, for the first several hundred years, public health has been all about keeping the waste streams as far away from the drinking water streams as possible. Now, with this DPR criteria, we're bringing those together. So we need to know for sure what the water quality is going into the treatment process and coming out of the treatment process. And we need to be able to detect when there's a problem and be able to take corrective actions to prevent any off-spec water from getting to the public. And this has to happen fast, within minutes for many of these treatment processes. These were the challenges that we gave to our criteria development team to include in the draft criteria. So with that, let's take a look at that criteria. Next slide, please. As you know, we've posted the draft criteria. That's why we're all here today to talk about that. So this early draft criteria has these 27 sections in it. We'll go over some of them briefly, but focusing mainly on the pathogen control and chemical control sections. Now with that, I'd like to turn this over to Jing, who's going to talk to you about some of these sections.
Thanks, Randy. So now I will briefly go over the sections highlighted in red. The criteria applies to any project that receives municipal wastewater for treatment to produce water that is used as a source of supply or to produce drinking water directly for distribution. The criteria will add a new Article 10 under Title 22, Chapter 17, which is a chapter describing requirements under the surface water treatment rule in the drinking water regulations. Next. In developing the criteria, DDW staff considered different possible DPR scenarios, including raw water augmentation using a small reservoir not meeting IPR requirements, as shown here. Next. To a raw water augmentation scenario where the advanced treated water is discharged to a pipeline or aqueduct. Next. Or to a small tank or forebay upstream of a water treatment plant. Next. And of course, we considered the treated water augmentation, where the finished water from an advanced water treatment plant is delivered directly to distribution. Next. We also considered complex DPR scenarios with multiple agencies and different qualities of water discharged for various reuse opportunities, ranging from non-potable to indirect potable to direct potable reuse. Through discussions with projects, we have a good idea of what DPR scenarios are being considered, but it is likely we haven't thought of everything. We're looking forward to comments regarding application of the draft criteria to DPR scenarios that we might not have considered. Next. So regardless of the complexity of a DPR project or the number of agencies involved, each project must designate one agency, called the DIPRA, that will be responsible for submitting a drinking water permit application for the project and for complying with the DPR regulations and permit provisions. Similar to IPR requirements, a public meeting must be held for the project as part of the permit review process. Public water systems receiving finished water from a DPR project will also need to submit drinking water permit applications and receive permit approval from DDW before the new supply can be used. The other agencies that are involved, including wastewater management agencies supplying the municipal wastewater source for the DPR project, and each agency that provides pathogen and/or chemical treatment pursuant to the DPR regulations will be required to be partner agencies in the joint plan. So the joint plan describes the partner agencies involved in the project, the roles and responsibilities of the partner agencies, the legal authority of each to fulfill its role, and the overall organizational structure involved in implementing the joint plan, among other things. The DIPRA must submit an updated joint plan when there's a change in the organizational or legal structure of the DPR project management. Each agency in the joint plan needs to demonstrate TMF capacity. Establishing the legal authorities, roles, and responsibilities, and the structure of the overall DIPRA organization for the DPR project is foundational to ensuring safe drinking water. Next. So regarding operator certification, each treatment plant distributing finished water must be operated by certified treatment operators. Treatment plants providing pathogen or chemical control pursuant to DPR criteria must be operated by an advanced water treatment AWTO5 certified operator. Treatment plants that do not distribute finished water must be operated by a certified operator that holds either a valid water treatment or wastewater treatment operator certification. An operator with an AWTO certification is at minimum a grade 3 wastewater treatment operator or a T3 water treatment operator who has undertaken additional coursework and testing on advanced water treatment processes and public health safe drinking water concepts. The AWTO certification program was established jointly by the Cal Nevada AWWA and CWEA in 2019. Now with that, let's go over to the next section where Bob Holquist will speak on the pathogen criteria. Thanks. Bob?
Thank you, Jing. Pathogenic microorganisms pose an acute threat unless continuously controlled by removal and inactivation. Several sections of the criteria deal with the control of this threat. Next slide, please. First, an overview of the pathogen control components. We set pathogen reduction targets to achieve specific health risk goals. Treatment reliability is achieved by requiring multibarrier treatment, diverse mechanisms in that treatment, and redundant treatment. Redundant treatment is extra treatment above that minimally necessary to make safe drinking water from the wastewater. And redundant treatment was called for by the state's direct potable reuse expert panel. We validate treatment to ensure the pathogen removal targets can be met. We require real-time monitoring, that's online monitoring of treatment performance for each process. We set pathogen control point critical limits. The pathogen control point is the effluent from each pathogen removal process. And the critical limit is a monitoring value for each treatment process that indicates if the treatment is effective. And then we have to have a control system for the treatment that responds appropriately to the online monitoring information. Next slide, please. We establish a risk goal for these criteria for pathogenic microorganisms. In drinking water regulations, such as the surface water treatment rule, the goal has been 1 in 10,000 chance of infection per year for an individual. We've also used that goal for our indirect potable reuse regulations. For direct potable reuse, because of the close proximity of the wastewater pathogen levels to the drinking water, we've decided we need a daily risk goal. In other words, we want very consistent production of safe water out of this treatment plant. So we divide the annual risk by 365, and every day the criteria have been designed such that every day that daily risk will be met. We establish reference pathogens. That's a set of pathogens that if we regulate and if they're controlled, all microbial risk will be dealt with from the wastewater. We've selected virus, Giardia, and cryptosporidium, as we did for our indirect potable reuse regulations. Those are the same reference pathogens used in the drinking water, surface water treatment rule. Indeed, the direct potable reuse has to comply with the surface water treatment rules, both the federal and the state, because the wastewater can be considered a surface water. We've researched pathogen densities. That was a portion of the research that Randy mentioned. So we have a good understanding of the pathogen hazard posed by municipal wastewater. In our risk management approach, we consider the worst case wastewater pathogen densities that we've seen in that research. And we take that approach rather than a probabilistic approach to avoid the chance of underestimating the pathogen risk. The log reduction required, the amount of treatment required for pathogens, is calculated as the ratio of the safe density of organisms in drinking water to the worst case wastewater density. That is 16 log or 16 orders of magnitude reduction of virus, 10 log reduction for Giardia, and 11 log reduction for cryptosporidium. The levels for virus are higher than you may have noticed in the indirect potable reuse regulations, because we've gone to norovirus as the virus of concern. And that relies on gene copies information rather than culture methods. Next slide, please. We achieve reliability in the treatment for pathogens by requiring for each reference pathogen at least 4 effective pathogen treatment processes. And they have to include at least 3 different mechanisms for pathogen reduction. And we specify in the regulation physical separation, chemical disinfection, and ultraviolet disinfection. The redundant or extra treatment called for by the expert panel, we're determining the amount of that extra treatment using a quantitative microbial risk assessment approach to evaluating failure scenarios. In other words, what sort of plausible or possible failure might quantify the extra treatment that would be needed. And the failure scenario we ended up with indicated a full log reduction of treatment loss was possible. And so we've added that on to the minimum treatment necessary to provide safe water as a design requirement. So the overall design of a treatment train has to be able to achieve 20 log, 14 log, and 15 log respectively for the virus, Giardia, and the cryptosporidium. Next slide, please. We validate each treatment process. The log reduction that can be achieved by a treatment is determined by a study that characterizes the performance of that treatment process for removing each of the reference pathogens. So here on this graph, we have an example of how a treatment process may perform. And across on the x-axis, we have the log reductions that it achieves. And on the y-axis, we have the cumulative distribution function. In other words, the time that it achieves the various log reductions. And we credit each process with its 5th percentile log reduction. And that's down in the lower left-hand end of the curve. So 95% of the time, the process will be achieving better treatment than we credited it with. And we have to correlate that performance with a measurable parameter using online monitoring. Next slide, please. Briefly, we validate each process by identifying the mechanisms of pathogen reduction by that process. We don't approve black boxes. We have to fully understand how the process works for each of the pathogens. We have to identify the pathogens to be used in the demonstration study or the surrogates for those pathogens. We have to identify the influencing factors that affect the efficacy of the process, things such as temperature, pH, loading rates. And we have in the study, it has to describe the method to collect and analyze the data. And again, the lower 5th percentile log reduction that it achieves during the study is the credited log reduction. And we determine critical limits, critical limit being the cutoff point for the monitoring data where you no longer have confidence in the efficacy of the process. Next slide, please. The treatment train for log reduction for virus, Giardia, and cryptosporidium is the sum of the treatment process individual 5th percentile log reductions. Any pathogen control point parameter that is not meeting the critical limit means the treatment process is not allowed the credited log reduction, and the control system deletes that treatment process in its compliance calculation. Let me just talk for a moment about the reliability of these processes. The fact that an individual process may not achieve less than the credited log removal 5% of the time does not pose a risk. Most of the time, each treatment is performing better than the credited 5th percentile removal. If you'll recall that graph I had on an earlier slide, most of the time it's doing much better than that credited level. So the chance that multiple processes operate at the low end of their performance curve simultaneously is tiny. And we're requiring at least 4 barriers. So the sum of the credited treatment process is very conservative. And it should also be noted that the extreme wastewater pathogen densities the treatment is designed for occur rarely. Most of the time, the pathogen densities are much lower than the worst case that we're designing the systems for. And quantitative microbial risk assessment analysis indicates that the daily risk goal will be met by systems meeting the treatment criteria. Next slide, please. We have operational requirements for the treatment train. The project must discontinue delivery to the drinking water system if the treatment train does not achieve the 16, 10, and 11 logs for virus, Giardia, and cryptosporidium. Those are the minimum necessary to go from worst case wastewater densities to safe drinking water. It must discontinue delivery if the minimum number of treatment processes that we specify are not working, or if the treatment mechanisms, the three diverse mechanisms, are not operating. It must discontinue within 24 hours if the treatment train does not achieve the design requirement of the 24, 14, and 15 log removals. This requires that the redundant or extra treatment must be restored quickly if the treatment train log reductions fall below the total design requirement. Next slide, please. Pathogen treatment and monitoring control. Treatment log reductions must be tracked continuously with the SCADA system. That's the control system for the treatment train, utilizing online monitoring for each process that was approved to receive credit for pathogen reduction. The control system must have associated alarms that indicated when the process is not operating as designed. The control system must be designed to identify a failure of a process to meet its critical limit. And finally, the control system must be designed to automatically stop the flow of inadequately treated water to the drinking water system before unsafe water reaches the system. And that is a summary of the pathogen control requirements. Brian Bernados will now address chemical contaminant control.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Brian Bernados, and I am in the recycled water unit. And this is a big day for us. Looking back over the last 10 plus years, and personally, I've been reflecting on how, I've been personally thinking about this since 2008, when I had the privilege to go to the Singapore International Water Week. And I heard Ian Law talk about how DPR is feasible. So I've been thinking about this, and our department's been thinking about this for a long time. So here we are. This is a big day. I'm going to talk about chemical control, and in a way, that's some of the most important considerations. So briefly, we're going to cover source control, the chemical control requirements, operations for that, and the control points, monitoring at those points, and response plans. Next slide, please. The goal of focusing on chemical control, the threat posed by chemicals in direct potable reuse means that advanced treatment must be provided to control the potential chronic exposure hazards from a wide variety of regulated and unregulated chemicals. Now, the threat posed by chemicals in direct potable reuse scenarios is different than those for indirect potable reuse in two important ways. Those are, without an environmental buffer, pulses of low molecular weight chemicals may pose an acute threat. Also, without an environmental buffer, it is urgent to recognize and respond to treatment deficiencies. The risk increases as the proximity becomes very close, and people could be drinking this within a matter of minutes. Next slide, please. The goal of the chemical control section in our draft regs is to remove chemicals to levels that are below public health concern. So this approach includes a number of things. We want enhanced source control and public education. I'll get into that in more detail later. Conformance with maximum contaminant levels and notification level requirements that are specific in California. The monitoring and also development of additional notification levels as appropriate. And note that Division of Drinking Water periodically adds to that list of notification levels, as we have recently. It requires multibarrier advanced treatment. Note that we are adding an additional chemical barrier to this treatment train. It needs to address pulses of low molecular weight chemicals. A good example of that is formaldehyde. I'll talk about that in detail later. We're going to have good control points and critical limits. And the SCADA and control systems need to have a really rigorous response plan. Next slide, please. So now digging into enhanced source control. First, we start with the requirements that are existing in our IPR regulations, both in groundwater and surface water or reservoir augmentation. We add to that a need to do a risk assessment for contaminants identified as part of source investigations. In other words, we want the DIPRA to assess potential hazards in the sewer shed. We want them to utilize local limits and other discharge control methods that would be designed to protect water quality for potable reuse. So they need to consider chemicals that may pass through our advanced oxidation and RO. We want an audit by an independent party of the source control program every 5 years. And we want them to have some sort of system that would give an early warning of potential chemical peaks. Now, that could be online monitoring at critical locations. And this is becoming feasible, as was noted in the recent Water Use Symposium, had a whole section on this, and an existing Water Research Foundation report, 1730, that's available for you to look at. And there are ongoing research projects, several of them being held now. So this is becoming a really interesting area. These would notify the release of contaminants above allowable limits. And we want monitoring of the local health surveillance programs. So that means somehow working with the county or other medical people to try to surveil and understand what may be happening to the community. And we want a source control committee to be part of this program. And the focus of that committee would be what's typically in the industry called a continuous improvement process, much similar to the ISO type of standards out there. Next slide, please. Now, I want to remind you from that 2016 report by the expert panel entitled Feasibility of Developing Uniform Water Recycling Criteria for Direct Potable Reuse. I picked a quote from that. They said, to be feasible, DPR systems must meet or exceed the attributes of robustness, resilience, and reliability that are in indirect potable reuse. They said robustness is defined by the presence of different types of treatment processes acting via different mechanisms, such that a yet unknown pollutant likely would be removed on multiple stages. So here's an example. You got biodegradation is a good mechanism, separation, and advanced oxidation. Next slide, please. So this means we have multibarrier treatment. And the treatment train must consist of at least 3 separate treatment processes, as has been mentioned above by Bob Holquist, with diverse mechanisms that are diverse for chemical reduction as well as pathogen. So that means including a ozone biological activation, a reverse osmosis that provides separation, and advanced oxidation process. The design criteria for ozone BOC is specified later. And these systems, all 3 of them, must have continuous performance monitoring, at least one surrogate or operational parameter that indicates when treatment is not being performed as designed. So for example, these are well known in the industry. Ozone to TOC ratio is one surrogate online. Absorbance is another one. TOC online, and of course, calculation of UV dose. And these all need to be demonstrated to be on spec at full operating conditions. Next slide, please. So I want to go into one of the research projects in depth, which was DPR4, that looked at chemicals and particularly peaks of chemicals. And so it's an excellent look at what type of things could address peaks. And so basically they were saying, what options beyond RO and AOP are out there? Now, of course, blending is one, and that works for any peak, but you need a lot of it. And that's what we rely on in our reservoir augmentation regs. We're having a large open reservoir or lake. Another they looked at was the ozone biologic activated carbon, which works on formaldehyde. They may pass through RO, AOP, and other things like acetone. They looked at granular activated carbon, and that works really well for disinfection byproducts like total trihalomethanes. And we're learning that it works for a lot of the long chain perfluoridated substances. We're still not sure about the short chain perfluoridated substances, and more research is being done by EPA and others. Works for a lot of VOCs, but not the highly polar VOCs, and it does not work for formaldehyde. They also considered air stripping, which is common in some groundwater treatment in contaminated groundwater. Works on certain VOCs, but it depends on Henry's law constant. And there are some VOCs that don't respond to air stripping. And then they actually looked at what would a second pass RO. So in other words, going through full treatment of all the water in one RO, and then taking that and going through it a second RO system. And of course, that would work, except it also has the weakness that RO has, that some neutral charged low molecular weight chemicals are not addressed. Next slide, please. So the ozone BAC that we've specified must achieve 1 log formaldehyde reduction. Now, formaldehyde becomes a very good indicator because it does pass through the RO-AOP. And it also has a notification level, so it has a health relevance. So we have design criteria that includes an ozone dose in the design feed to TOC of greater than 1 ratio, and an empty bed contact time of at least 15 minutes. This process needs to identify continuously monitored surrogates or operational parameters that tell us that the operators that the system is working, and these have to be monitored in real time. So as I mentioned before, this would be ozone residuals, absorbance, TOC, could be UV dose or UV energy, could be free chlorine dose. And then conduct a demonstration study on the ozone BAC. So you need to design for the 1 log formaldehyde and then demonstrate it under full operating conditions. And in some cases, you may have to spike formaldehyde, like we do for 1,4-dioxane on the AOP for indirect polar reuse. Next slide, please. Now, the RO process will have the same design criteria, which is an ASTM standard, as we have for indirect polar reuse. And additionally, of course, as we already do, have at least 1 continuously monitored surrogate to tell if the integrity is maintained by the RO process and identify the control limits. Now, what we have done with DPR is because the time is short before it's consumed by people, we want to tighten the criteria and optimize the RO. So we've set a TOC level of 0.1 that has to be met continuously and if it's not over 24 hours, then perform a 5-day trihalomethane formation potential study on the RO permeate. This is quite feasible. The TOC over 0.15 continuously over 5 days, you'd have to investigate the integrity of RO membrane. And there are commonly known tools in the industry, like conductivity probes, that are performed for many desal plants around the world and brackish plants, and done for polar reuse indirect polar use. Next slide, please. Of course, we'll still maintain the advanced oxidation that has to achieve at least a 0.5 log 1,4-dioxane reduction and identify good surrogates as well. And continue to, for a new plant to prove that it works at full scale. Next slide, please. So we're talking about chemical peaks, and here's the reason that we are talking about it. And this was highlighted by our expert panel that we needed to address this type of peak. And as you see, the feed water TOC was humming along between 8 and 10, averaging about 9, and then over a period of about 15 hours or so, it started to peak up to 21, and that was bad enough. But the permeate spiked from really low, that was below 0.1, to above 7, which is like a 70-fold increase. Now, the effluent was tested to see what passed, and it was found out that acetone was what passed, the RO and the AOP. Unfortunately, acetone is not that toxic. But what about things we don't know? So we wanted to address that, and our expert panel said we needed to address that. Next slide, please. So DPR4 looked at chemicals that might pass RO and AOP. Unfortunately, there's very few chemicals that actually do that. But those are chemicals that are low molecular weight, such as less than 100 molecular weight, could pass RO. And some chemicals are resistant to advanced oxidation, like formaldehyde. So to address this, we have 3 components in our rate. We have the ozone BAC. We have a requirement for continuous longitudinal mixing to attenuate a 1-hour elevated concentration of a contaminant by a factor of 10. And that could occur anywhere from the wastewater plant inlet to the place where it's effluent. We've also added additional TOC limits to address peaks and help investigate those. So above 0.25, an investigation of the source control program should be triggered. Like what's happening? I mean, is there an industry doing something? And that early warning system should have given the DIPRA some sort of clue of where to look. And also, as was mentioned earlier, we're going to have a limit of 0.5 for TOC because this is DPR as a critical limit. And we consider it an acute limit, an acute threat. And so therefore we require automatic diversion above 0.5. Next slide, please. So the monitoring control, of course, is very important. And as I've mentioned before, these can be tracked continuously with the SCADA system. And those surrogates should be approved in the operations plan. The control system must have associated alarms that indicate when the process is not on spec. And it should be designed to identify a failure that doesn't meet its critical limit. Next slide, please. So the response time, the critical control response time, is defined as the time it takes for a control system to identify and respond to an acute exposure threat. Now that includes the time interval between online measurements taken at a control point. So that could be anywhere from 1 minute to 5 minutes, depending on the instrument. The time it takes for online measurements to be assessed and evaluated by the SCADA system, whether the critical control limit is being met. And so often the SCADA system will average these online measurements over a time period of 10 or 15 minutes to make sure that it is really something happening. Time it takes for the SCADA system to determine that the 0.5 limit has been exceeded, or if the nitrate online instrument exceeds the MCL, which is 10. Time to actuate diversion or shutoff valve. So that could be anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the size of the valve, shutoff valve. And divert or completely stop the flow to the distribution system. Next slide, please. So the response time must be able to automatically discontinue delivery of the water within that chemical control response time identified above, which could be 15 minutes or more, as I noted. The time it takes for 10% of the water to flow along the flow path from each control point to the point of diversion or shutoff should be no less than the chemical control response time. Next slide, please. So the system needs to automatically discontinue delivery. This is, I'm reiterating, but this is important for acute exposures. So we're considering that a TOC limit over the 0.5, an exceedance of the nitrate MCL, as I mentioned, 10, or an online instrument, which may be installed in the future. I know there's development of these for standards like perchlorate or lead, which are acute chemicals. Next slide, please. And this needs to be optimized. The DIPRA must do a chemical characterization and control study to evaluate precursors. Now we know that some things are precursors that form into toxic chemicals. And the production of these byproducts, including disinfection byproducts, and then options for optimizing and reducing these type of byproducts to protect public health. And incorporate this optimization strategy into the operations plan. So that concludes my summary of the chemical control. I'm going to hand it over to Jing, who's going to explain a lot of other miscellaneous things in our reg.
All right, thanks, Brian. So I will briefly go over the rest of the sections of the early draft. All right, so now we're on the next slide. Let's see, water quality monitoring. All right, so the draft criteria specifies monitoring for regulated contaminants, which are contaminants with primary MCL, a secondary MCL, or action level, and also unregulated contaminants. So this is similar to the monitoring requirements for IPR and extremely impaired drinking water sources. The criteria specifies sampling at the feed to the DPR plant, sampling immediately after the advanced oxidation process, and sampling of the finished water prior to distribution. Next. So for a simple treated water augmentation scenario, the regulated and unregulated chemical monitoring must be done at the feed and at a finished water compliance point prior to distribution. So the draft includes requirements to discontinue delivery of water if an analytical result for a sample collected at the finished water compliance point shows an exceedance of the MCL or other specified limit. Next. Now for a complex DPR scenario, the monitoring requirements can be complex. And we added a requirement that addresses the submittal of a monitoring plan separate from the operations plan for this purpose. Next. We kept an alternatives section in the DPR draft. The alternatives section in the draft is similar to the one in the surface water augmentation regulation, and we added detail to the chemical treatment alternatives. So for chemical treatment, the alternative train must use 3 different treatment mechanisms with a required separation mechanism. It must use validated technology, or the project must conduct a demonstration study to demonstrate the treatment efficacy of that new technology. It must demonstrate the alternative provides equivalent or better performance, and also it assures at least the same level of public health protection. Next. So we made the alternative section flexible enough to allow consideration of benefits provided by project-specific features, such as small environmental buffers. And we invite the stakeholders to test scenarios against the criteria and provide any feedback to us on this. Next. So regarding public notification, the DIPRA is required to provide an initial public notice when the DPR project water is first delivered to customers. A Tier 1 public notice, which is the notice that you provide as soon as possible within 24 hours for these conditions listed, such as failure to maintain the minimum 16 and 11 LFE. And DIPRA must also provide an annual consumer confidence report. and also an annual report on the DPR project itself. Next. And finally, plans and reports. The draft refers to a number of plans or reports that must be submitted. So most of this reporting is information we already require of public water systems to submit, such as the ones shown in blue and the overlap. The others are existing reporting that the IPR projects are already required to do, such as the joint plan and the annual report. The two plans that are new are the water safety plan and the pathogen and chemical control monitoring and response plan. The control plan, which Brian and Bob talked about. The water safety plan is an independent risk assessment to identify risk management controls as a precaution against unaddressed site-specific hazards. The assessment must be submitted with the engineering report and updated at least every 5 years or following any incident caused by a lapse of control or inability to properly manage a risk. So this is the last slide on the addendum overview. So next. So these are the next steps of the process. The comment period will close on June 25th. And we appreciate if you can send in your written comments as soon as possible. And we look forward to hearing your comments today. We are going through the Health and Safety Code Section 5704 peer review process right now. And we will consider stakeholder comments as well as peer review process comments to prepare a set of draft criteria for the expert panel to review. So the AB 574 requires that an expert panel be put in place to review the set of criteria and make adopt a finding as to whether, in its expert opinion, the draft criteria would adequately protect public health. And the state board cannot adopt the regulations until the expert panel makes that finding. Next. All right, so the panel members will be a distinguished expert in one of the following areas listed. So expertise in microbial risk assessments is needed to evaluate the draft criteria. An environmental chemist with a public health background and both research laboratory and practical applications experience will help determine the current nature and fate of the treatment of chemicals found in wastewater and provide expertise in analytical methodology. An environmental health and public health microbiologist will identify the microorganisms in wastewater that must be controlled and subject to microbial risk assessments. A water treatment engineer can evaluate the efficacy and reliability of water treatment technologies for potable reuse, including process control monitoring and supervisory control systems. A wastewater treatment engineer will do the same thing with their expertise in the wastewater treatment and potable and non-potable reuse. A toxicologist can determine the public health significance of chemicals found in wastewater and the chemical byproducts of wastewater and drinking water treatment related to direct potable reuse. They can also provide expertise in reproductive and developmental toxicology and endocrine disruption. An expert in multi-barrier system reliability can help quantify for use in regulation the reliability of various sets of barriers beyond normal risk assessment and treatment knowledge. Public health expertise is valuable for evaluating the scientific literature regarding health outcomes for exposure to various qualities of drinking water and evaluating the potential for illness with non-potable and potable reuse. And finally, expertise in treatment operations, supervisory control, and factors impacting operations such as TMF, technical, managerial, and financial capacity in potable reuse is valuable to the review as well. And if you think a particular expertise is not described here is needed, I'd like to hear of it. So please send in your thoughts as well on this. All right, thank you. Next. We are working on a contract with NWRI to convene and administer the expert panel. And we have 4 meetings planned between August 2021 and April 2022. A 5th meeting is available if needed. The contract will run through 2023, and we will address contingencies in the contract. For instance, if we don't get a panel consensus or if additional research is necessary. We expect the expert panel to reach consensus and provide a memo to the state board in April 2022 regarding their final findings on the protection of public health. And finally, adoption of the DPR criteria is required by December 2023. And the AB 574 provides an 18-month extension if needed. Next. So for more information, please contact me. There's my phone number, and you can also email us at the DDW Recycle Water email address. And you can also visit our webpage. It provides the background of all this, since 2016 and before. All the documents we posted for public comment, and the status of what's coming up, latest information, reports. And you can also subscribe to our email listserv from there. And next. So this concludes the presentation. I'll leave you with information to provide written comments, and I'll hand it over to you, David. Thanks.
At this time, we're going to take a short break. Next slide. Just a reminder, if you're currently only watching and listening into the webcast, but you'd like to make oral comments after the break, then go to www.zoom.us and enter meeting ID 964-1925-5652. Also, please send an email to ddwrecycledwater@waterboards.ca.gov. In the subject line, indicate DPR Addendum Workshop. In the body of the email, include the following items: your name and organization, whether you wish to comment via Zoom or by phone, and if calling in, provide your area code and the last 3 digits of your phone number. Next slide. We'll be back in 10 minutes at 10:40. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Our first commenter will be Paul Beswick.
Thank you very much. Should I start my video as well?
Sure,
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, let me proceed. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this particularly important public meeting. I will try to keep my remarks brief. My name is Paul Beswick, and I am speaking on behalf of myself. As well as being an avid supporter of wastewater recycling, I have some understanding of drinking water sources and treatment, including chlorine and ozone disinfection. Having worked for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California for over 20 years, retiring several years ago as a senior environmental specialist. I find the timing of today's public meeting particularly auspicious, coming on Earth Day and the day after Governor Newsom's press conference on the current drought we are facing. Only a science denier can ignore the impact that climate change will have on the droughts we will be facing in the future. Wastewater recycling with advanced treatment and direct potable reuse provides an answer for alternative drinking water sources that is so obvious it must not be ignored. Advanced treatment effluent from wastewater treatment blended into wastewater treatment plant influent offers a sensible and critically important new drinking water source. Let me say furthermore that wastewater recycling with advanced treatment should be considered a far higher priority than desalination as an alternative drinking water source. Studies have conclusively shown that wastewater recycling with advanced treatment is more energy efficient and has a far smaller environmental footprint than desalination. In summary, it is my fervent belief that the time for direct potable reuse as a drinking water treatment plant source is now, and we must not miss this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Our next commenter is Heather Collins.
Okay, I'm not able to start my video for some reason because the host has stopped it, it says, so.
That's okay. Please just go ahead with the audio.
Okay, very well. Again, my name is Heather Collins. I work for the Metropolitan Water District, and I want to say thank you for the opportunity for Metropolitan to comment today on the state board's early draft criteria of anticipated framework for direct potable reuse regulation. Metropolitan would like to commend the Water Board staff for developing well-defined criteria for potential DPR projects. The Water Board's release of this early draft criteria is very helpful for agencies to get an early glimpse of what might be needed for a DPR project, as it takes many years to develop a potential project. Metropolitan supports the water recycling, including DPR, as a way to improve regional self-reliance and to meet future water supply needs. Currently, Metropolitan is pursuing a regional recycling water program in partnership with the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts to beneficially reuse water that is currently discharged to the Pacific Ocean. Our program would consist of 100 million gallons per day of advanced water treatment facility at the Los Angeles County Sanitation District's current joint water pollution control plant in Carson, California. This facility would receive treated wastewater effluent from the JWPCP, meaning our proposed facility, and employ AWT processes to purify the water for recharge of regional groundwater basins. However, there's also an opportunity for Metropolitan to incorporate direct potable reuse through what we're terming raw water augmentation and what you've characterized in an earlier form of DPR as part of our program. This is whereby purified water would be conveyed as an additional source supply for one or two of Metropolitan's existing drinking water treatment plants, where it would be blended with other surface water supply sources. Metropolitan and the county sanitation districts are currently conducting demonstration testing of advanced water treatment train that includes validating membrane bioreactor technology for potable reuse. Through this project, we've been working closely with the Division of Drinking Water as well as the Los Angeles and Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Boards to evaluate pathogen removal through MBRs and overall water quality of the advanced treatment water train. We want to recognize the Water Board staff time, effort, and active engagement with our agencies on this innovative endeavor. Some general comments and observations at this point. We have submitted comments onto the 2 previous editions of Framework, and we appreciate the Water Board addressing some of the comments in this addendum. While we understand the Water Board's approach for a single regulatory packet and recognizes the challenge of developing a regulation for all various forms of DPR, we feel it's important that there's flexibility within the criteria to account for potentially lower risk DPR projects. For example, here, I'm speaking to the raw water augmentation project concept with a low blend of purified water delivered to a drinking water treatment plant with extensive history of treating varied surface water sources, which provide additional safeguards when compared with a treated water augmentation project that may lack some flexibility and barriers. With respect to treatment requirements, those that were outlined and speaking about this morning with pathogen control, with 2014-15 virus Giardia cryptosporidium levels, the required level of pathogen reduction is higher than we anticipated, which translates then into extensive demonstration testing and monitoring for the agencies. Validation studies required will be rigorous, and greater guidance would be, we're seeking greater guidance on the approach to conduct a validation study for an existing drinking water treatment plant. Also, under low purified water blend scenarios with existing surface waters, could a drinking water plant be credited pathogen removals granted to it through filtration technologies and disinfection under the current surface water treatment rule? This would minimize the need for agencies to make significant investments to conduct extensive validation studies for drinking water treatment plants that have demonstrated a history of compliance under multiple sources. Greater guidance on achieving credits for the existing water treatment plant, as well as upstream wastewater treatment plants, will help agencies determine what additional advanced water treatment processes may be needed to achieve the required pathogen control. In the area of TMF, technical, managerial, and financial capacity elements, there are a lot of elements here that were outlined, and we do understand that there are some that are duplicative of what is currently required for a public water system, but overarchingly greater than anticipated. We want to know if there's opportunity to combine the plans that would be submitted for both the public water system and the DPRA for a project, or if they need to be independent. These plans, if separate, will require significant time, resources, and financial means for agencies to develop the documents. And we're hopeful that the water boards also have sufficient resources to work with the agencies in reviewing the information and support the timely implementation of DPR projects. We do appreciate the water boards providing clarity on the permitting authority for DPR projects. However, for several of the DPRA requirements, such as ensuring compliance with wastewater source control elements and implementing a watershed sewer surveillance program for early warning, a DPRA that's a public water system under the jurisdictional authority and statutory authority of Safe Drinking Water Act, we feel that we may not have the full compliance authority. This requirement may be falling better in line as an extension of the wastewater source control program. We acknowledge there needs to be strong partnerships between the DPRA and the wastewater agency, along with other partnering entities for a successful project, but we're seeking greater clarification on the statutory authority in these subject areas. On the item of certification and staffing requirements for advanced water treatment operators, Metropolitan, having certified and experienced operators working at the treatment plants, assures responsible control and operations. For DPR projects, a process train may involve multiple decentralized facilities. For example, the wastewater treatment plant then goes to the AWT plant. then to the drinking water plant. The DPR criteria requires the water treatment operators, the AWTOs with grade 5 certification at each facility included in the DPR project where pathogen control is provided, with 24/7, 365 coverage for both chief and shift operators. This could pose significant challenges for some agencies as there's time that's needed to develop experience and get everybody up to those levels. So we're seeking greater clarification on the need and number of certified operators required, the extent of on-site coverage, and if there are multiple treatment facilities within the DPR project, consider AWT, satellite, et cetera, what are those staffing requirements, or is there flexibility thereof? In closing, we appreciate the opportunity to provide these preliminary observations on the DPR framework, and again, wish to thank the Water Board for providing this early glimpse. Metropolitan is reviewing the draft criteria, and we do plan to provide formal comments by the indicated June 25th date. And finally, we look forward to working with the Water Board and our water industry partners to help support the development of clear, practical regulatory criteria for DPR that is fully protective of public health. And that concludes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. And our next commenter will be Jennifer West.
Good morning. Looks like I'm without a video, but that's fine. So good morning. Thank you very much. I'm Jennifer West. I'm the Managing Director of Water Reuse California. And first of all, I want to thank DDW for getting these draft criteria out in a very timely manner. We're really encouraged to see a well-written, comprehensive document. And with this, we are pretty confident that we're going to be able to make the AB 574 timeline of adoption by December 2023. So this is great news for us. It is an exciting day, as Brian indicated earlier. We believe that these criteria and understanding will help our members move forward with their DPR projects. So specifically on the draft criteria, we think we understood from the early framework, and we support the requirements that that there was both criteria for both raw water augmentation and treated drinking water augmentation. But at first glance, the draft imposed the same requirements for both. So we believe there may be elements of the raw water augmentation that enhance public protection. And by not accounting for these differences in the regulations may drive more projects toward the treated drinking water augmentation. So we'd like DDW to consider ways to account for the differences and more fully credit the raw water augmentation projects for the additional public health elements that these types of projects provide. Moving on to the pathogen requirements, we acknowledge that there needs to be a higher pathogen control for DPR. And we appreciated the overview that Bob Holquist gave about that. These are, in fact, higher than anticipated. We're going to go over and we appreciate understanding a little bit more about the rationale for that, but we'd like to more thoroughly understand the rationale for those higher LRV requirements. On the chemical control, again, we recognize the need for this additional chemical control for DPR. But that said, the O3 and the BAC requirements are in fact very prescriptive, and this may inhibit innovation. So we recommend that rather specifying the design criteria, DDW should consider specifying performance goals for the additional chemical control. One precedent for this is the 0.5 log 1,4-dioxin requirement for AOP in the indirect potable reuse regulations that allow agencies to determine what treatment they will use to best accomplish this. Such an approach would provide more flexibility to achieve equivalent levels of chemical control. On the TMF requirements, again, we understand more will be needed for DPR. We're looking at potential overlaps of the plans and the reports here as described, and we really encourage you to look for opportunities to streamline this process, to streamline these plans and reporting requirements for oversight. So we do want to appreciate the inclusion of the alternatives clause. We think this will allow projects to pursue innovative approaches that can provide equivalent public health protections. And again, thank you very much for the inclusion of that. Overall, these are well-written and thoughtful draft DPR criteria. And we are very excited to continue to work with you and provide written detailed comments for Water Reuse California and our membership by the deadline. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And our next commenter is Martha Tremblay.
Hi, thank you, David. Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you fine.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Martha Tremblay, and I'm a department head at the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts. And my department is responsible for our recycled water program, which is one of the largest in the country. We've been providing recycled water for groundwater recharge for over 60 years and are currently in partnership with MWD to reuse treated wastewater from our joint water pollution control plant, which currently discharges to the ocean. And previously you heard Heather talk about a bit. This recycled water will be a new source of water for our region, and we're excited for the development of direct potable reuse regulations, as we see this as critical for increasing the amount of recycled water that can be used to provide water resiliency to our communities and region. Direct potable reuse is necessary to meet the state's goal to maximize water recycling, and there simply isn't enough municipal demand for irrigation and industrial use, and indirect potable reuse opportunities are limited in many circumstances. Even in Los Angeles, where we have an abundance of groundwater storage opportunities, there's not enough capacity to put all of our recycled water into the ground. We appreciate the work that has gone into development of the framework, and we will be submitting detailed written comments. You know, while we recognize the importance of protecting public health and ensuring the public's confidence in new water supplies, the draft regulations appear to incorporate many requirements and factors of safety. And, you know, it's not clear, always clear in terms of that connection to public health. So we definitely would like to better understand DDW's reasoning and basically have a dialogue about some of these requirements. We hope that there might be some instances where additional flexibility can be allowed, perhaps maybe after certain benchmarks are met for operating facilities. So we also, we hope that the state board considers providing flexibility where possible. So for example, Heather touched on this a little bit in terms of requiring grade 5 operators at all times for each treatment facility. I mean, something like this is a challenge and might not be necessary considering the level of planning, coordination, and training that the draft regulations require in other areas that will result in highly trained staff working at well operating facilities. So just lastly, now this comment is more related to public perception than a technical comment. And we understand the role of a wastewater treatment facility is critical in ensuring that the follow-on treatment at that downstream facility not be affected. And we do believe that it's important that we provide the highest quality recycled water that we can. However, we're a bit concerned in seeing terms in the draft document using, extremely impaired source or highly contaminated source, which are used several times in the draft document that's out for public review. I understand it's not going to be part of the regulation. And, I'm aware that this terminology has been used for a long time by DDW staff and that it has a specific meaning. But, we're concerned about the potential negative message that this type of terminology in a public document can give to the public at a time when their support is critical in furthering the use of recycled water. Instead, we would recommend, simply call it what it is or call it source water. And that way, not give an impression of it's a highly contaminated source of water. Ultimately, our recycled water is good water that can be treated and can be used safely for direct potable reuse. So in conclusion, we want to thank the state board for their significant effort in so far, and we look forward to working together with our water agency partners and the state board to complete this regulatory process and proceed with the planning and implementation of exciting new projects that will help meet the state's water supply resilience goals. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Martha. Our next comment actually came in to the chat, and it is from Don Taffler with Kennedy Jenks, and I'd like to read it now. The framework does not specifically address the need for storage or an engineered buffer, but under section 64669.50, chemical control, there's reference to attenuation time between the start of the wastewater treatment plant and the water distribution system, as cited below. Can you please clarify this requirement and how the project would demonstrate compliance? And then in subsection K, the treatment train, storage, and conveyance must provide continuous longitudinal mixing of the flow between the terminus of the wastewater collection system and the entry to the drinking water distribution system, sufficient to attenuate a 1 hour elevated concentration of a contaminant by a factor of 10. Mixing that occurs between the wastewater treatment plant inlet chamber and the DPR project finished water compliance point may be used to meet this requirement. So again, that comment came into the chat from Don Taffler with Kennedy Jenks. And our next commenter is Jesus Gonzalez.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jesus Gonzalez, Manager of Recycled Water Policy here at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And first and foremost, on behalf of all of us at DWP, we too would like to thank DDW for its work on potable reuse and for holding this workshop. The release of the draft criteria come at a very opportune time for us in LA as well, given that we have various DPR projects in the works. To provide some context as to why we are so excited with the release of the framework is that some of you may know that Los Angeles is moving towards beneficially using 100% of the city's available treated wastewater by 2035. We refer to this ambitious effort as our Operation Next program. And under Mayor Garcetti's leadership and working alongside our partner agency, LA Sanitation, once this multi-billion-dollar effort is completed, it'll provide 1/3 of our city's water supply for the 4 million customers we serve. Now, the reason I mention this program is that Operation Next incorporates a portfolio of both indirect and direct potable solutions that require a hybrid approach, one that we think should be tailored to specific potable reuse settings and water treatment needs. Now, recognizing that our Operation Next program is a hybrid, again, of IPR and DPR, we are also concurrently developing a demonstration DPR project at our Headworks Reservoir Complex to identify equivalent advanced treatment strategies, alternative purification processes, blending strategies, and a whole host of other approaches. We believe this research and information could support the further development of the draft criteria and also provide value to the various other water agencies that have the same hybrid project that we have. Now, that background is to make one overarching point, which is that we also request that the Water Board provide greater flexibility to the treatment requirements. We believe there is merit in considering a toolbox approach to the treatment requirements, similar to the approach used by the EPA in the surface water treatment rules. This would enable agencies to consider factors such as dilution, enhanced monitoring, alternative treatment technologies tailored to unique project settings. We hope that DDW will consider changes to the criteria so that DWP, along with other agencies, can draw from a larger treatment toolbox to meet public health goals established by DDW. Thank you for your time. And again, we applaud the progress you've made with the draft criteria.
Thank you, Jesus. And our next commenter is Jared Voskuhl.
Hi, good morning. Jared Voskuhl, Manager of Regulatory Affairs for CASA, the California Association of Sanitation Agencies. CASA represents more than 125 public agencies and municipalities that engage wastewater collection, treatment, recycling, and resource recovery. And our organization's vision is to advance public policy and programs that promote the clean water community's efforts in achieving environmental sustainability and protection of public health. We wanted to thank the State Water Board for getting these draft criteria out in a timely manner. It was very encouraging to see such well-written and a comprehensive document. It gives us confidence we'll meet the timeline set out in Assembly Bill 574, and it's important for meeting the recycled water goals for the state. Briefly, we just wanted to formally support the remarks of Jennifer West of Water Reuse and Martha Tremblay from LACSD. We're aligned with their interests and input on these draft criteria, and we look forward to working with the State Water Board going forward on this, and we'll be providing comments by the June 25th deadline. Thank you for letting me provide these comments today.
Thank you, Jared. And that is actually the last commenter that we had in our queue. And since we reached the end, just if there happen to be any others, if you'd like to use the raise hand feature in Zoom, we could allow you to speak. So far, not seeing any. We'll give this just a moment. Down near the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a button for reactions, and in there you can click on raise hand, just in case some of you are unfamiliar. Well, not seeing any raised hands, I'd like to conclude this workshop, and I'd like to thank all the commenters very much for their participation. Also thank the presenters, our AV services staff, and all the State Water Board staff behind the scenes who helped to make this workshop possible. Thank you. Goodbye.